Incompatible cultures. I want you to put that in your vocabulary, and let me repeat it again. There are incompatible cultures, and not just incompatible, but destructive to ours and any Western nation. The problem is Islam, and we all know it. Well, welcome back to Jack's Corner, where truth and reality have a seat at the table. Today I have some really important topics to cover and some pretty rough truths to grasp and to adopt if you haven't already. So let's get started. You know, as the old saying goes, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it, and those who do know history are doomed to watch others repeat it. This is at least what I hope to avoid for myself, but out of compassion for the youth who don't deserve the consequences of their parents' misfeasance, if not malfeasance, I do these podcasts to avoid the horrors of the past. This is what happens when the prior generations do not pass on the lessons of the past. They hire woke liberal teachers and professors to instruct their children. Within the last 100 years, 120 million people were exterminated, murdered, and executed by communist regimes. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers died defending America from communism, yet our largest city, New York City, just elected a communist mayor. What idiots are in New York City? Shame on us. This is unforgivable. The only way to stop this is to impose the harshest penalties and consequences on those engaged in such senseless conduct by voting that way. This is the byproduct of these citadels of atheism, but for now, I want to address another consequence of forgetting history. We have some very dangerous cultures in this world that are incompatible with any other, that need to be segregated. But even more dangerous are the white liberals and leftists in this country and the Western world who suffer from the delusion that communism is the only way forward. They seem devoid of any knowledge of history. But then there are many people who are quite comfortable ignoring the lessons of history. The white liberal exhibits many mental problems such as cognitive dissonance, resentment, rage, hypocrisy, projectionism, and the list goes on. Stupid Americans will lead us into another civil war, and our enemies can't wait. After all, they have been undermining us for decades for the opportunity that is before them now. Just this week, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey recently won re-election, but his victory speech has drawn criticism. Why? Because while on stage, he was speaking Somali, laughing like a fool at America as he celebrated the 65th anniversary of Somalia's independence. Not America's independence, not Minnesota's heritage. He's performing in Somali for a crowd that barely speaks English, in a city he has helped transform into a little Mogadishu. Frey isn't leading Minneapolis, he's surrendering it. He has legalized blasting the Islamic call to prayer 5 times a day, starting at dawn. Can you imagine the outrage of Christians if they did that? Also, he lifted noise laws to let mosques blast Arabic prayers across the city. Folks, Mayor Frey is a traitor to his own kind and culture. Now, this treason is not isolated to Minneapolis, but as far as I'm concerned, if I had the power, I would denaturalize Frey and deport him. Do you remember, and you should if you are older than 35, that on 9/11, 2001, the World Trade Towers were brought down by Islamists. 24 years later, New Yorkers voted in a Muslim communist for mayor, Zohran Mamdani. America is not a united union anymore, and fewer of us have anything in common with other parts of the country. In Virginia, the voters elected the highest law enforcement officer, that is, Attorney General candidate Jay Jones, who texted his desires to see Republicans murdered and their children killed. When confronted, all he did was say, "I'm sorry." Folks, the hearts and minds of many Americans are so depraved and corrupt that we are in danger of devolving into another civil war. If you travel to the northeast of this country, the majority are atheists, cold, callous, and believers in communism, given their associations and who they place in office. It's utterly incredible how this evil virus of psychosis has created such a mental illness with so many that we literally have nothing in common, or, for that matter, principles that bind us together anymore. To the Christian church, we are collapsing in this country. How about sending missionaries to the spiritually dark parts of this country for a change? The blue states have no love of country. They have been taught that America is bad, yet they won't leave. I wish they would. Now, some of my Christian brethren say, well, they are lost, and we need to love them and make them see the light. Well, I don't argue with fools, as Proverbs instructs, and I don't water the weeds and enable bad conduct to prevail. In the instance of the Muslims and Islamists, they believe that killing Christians and Jews and anyone not Muslim is in service to their God. This is why they can justify the terror that accompanies them. Now, good luck in preaching to them. Now, I'm not going to get into a theological debate here, but I recall my friend Dr. Voddie Baucham once lecturing on the problem within the Christian church, to which he said it's a sissified image of Jesus. Too many Christians today think that Jesus needs a PR makeover. Too many pastors are seeker-friendly and walk and talk in subdued, monotone voices. Jesus confronted the lie and boldly promoted the truth regardless of its offensiveness. In reality, the truth is only offensive to those who prefer to live the lie. Jesus was no faint heart when he took the whip to the money changers in the temple. Today, you could easily confuse many pastors today with the effeminate LGBTQ crowd. The help this country needs is from the pulpit, but based on my experience, good luck. The raw and uncooked truth is never served up, or rarely. It comes out as a mushy, overcooked dish of food. Then we have the likes of Alex Soros, who has taken up the mantle of his father, George Soros. This family is the source of so much societal destruction that it is an indictment upon our political leaders as to why this family has not been incarcerated. The near bankruptcy of the Bank of England and the near collapse of the Hungarian economy and the communist erosion in this country can all be tied to Soros and hundreds of organizations linked to him. Hell cannot come soon enough for Soros, albeit he is a heartbeat away from it. But then we still have to contend with the son who will have his father's tens of billions of dollars to undermine this country, and they've been doing it for decades. Too many common sense and regular Americans create so much of the drama and threats we face to our freedoms simply because they won't act. It is so bizarre to see the country facing its extinction and demise with such denial, if not indifference. Subsequent to the elections last week, Muslims are gloating over a Muslim takeover of our largest city. But the communists are celebrating too because Mamdani is that as well. Now, socialist Bernie Sanders, a communist, wants to take Mamdani's message across the country. California voters voted to wipe out 5 Republican congressional seats, leaving only 4 congressional seats out of 52 in a state where 40% of the voters are Republican. This is the nature of the left, people. If I were to draw a picture of the Antichrist, Gavin Newsom would probably be the perfect model. He's a dangerous and pathological narcissist. There is simply no truth in this man, and he looks into the TV camera and lies with impunity, knowing many of you will do nothing about it, not even register a complaint. The extent of most average Americans' reaction when they see these things on TV is, well, that's disgusting. Then they turn off the TV and then walk away. Now, let's look at other evidence of decay in America. Virginia and New Jersey elected as governors some of the most radical, raging feminists. If you gave them a crew cut, they would look like men, the gender that they hate, and they will place men back into women's sports in bathrooms. Folks, you hear Democrats gaslighting you that they are protecting democracy. They have no intention of that, and in fact, they are camouflaging their destruction of it. But then they also know that there are enough idiots out there that will fall for it, and once they wake up, it will be too late. Now, never forget that it was communists who came up with that term, quote, useful idiots. The Democrat left is so much better at the political chess game than Republicans. So many on the Republican side, if they were to be interviewed by me, would never get hired. And it's truly sad. Well, here's the bottom line of the recent elections. First of all, in New Jersey has been a blue state for as long as I can remember. They suffer from the highest tax rates in energy bills. And I hope it continues and that it gets worse. Why? Because the only way to get people to change, unfortunately, is suffering, which tends to clear the mind. After being freed from Pharaoh, the Israelites within days started complaining. God saw they were stiff necks and would never change and cursed them such that that generation would never enter the promised land. He knew that generation had to die off to get rid of that kind of toxic and diseased thinking. Likewise, I too refuse to suffer the indignity of engaging in useless debate with irrational people. Next, the election in Virginia. Once a red state, the Democrats flipped it blue by increasing the size of the federal government in D.C., and those workers would end up residing in Northern Virginia. 90% of the government workforce belongs to the Democrat left. It's just like apartment dwellers. They are largely Democrat voters. They have no skin in the game. The Democrats made home ownership so costly that no one can afford a home or skin in the game, and that further cements in them a leftist attitude. Like dogs to their vomit, once infected with the leftist disease and psychosis, it's incurable. That is what the Democrats want, and that is what they have gotten. Now, as for New York City, God has more cause to rain fire and brimstone down on it than likely he did in Sodom and Gomorrah. But then New York was never going to be a win for a Republican. In reflection, the Democrats did not have a big win on Tuesday night. They just kept what they already had. Nothing really changed. They once again fooled the fools in their state and those God-hating hedonists who will continue to suffer under the high taxes and energy prices that they voted for. And this will inevitably get worse because the smart people are moving away, shrinking the tax base, which will require higher taxes on the ones that stay behind. Now, this should really fire you up. It does me. Around 600,000 people that voted for Trump in 2024 didn't bother to vote in those states. Folks, we have seen the enemy, and the enemy is us. I wish that normal, conservative, common-sense Americans would flee from the cities of destruction, to steal a term from the book Pilgrim's Progress, the second best-selling book of all time next to the Bible, and I highly recommend it. What that flight would look like is that conservative, common-sense people would flee the blue states to the red states, like Florida, Texas, Tennessee, and on, thus increasing their presidential electoral count, as well as increasing the number of Republicans and conservatives in the Congress. Sometimes the only thing one can do is move. And I know not everyone can do that, but hundreds of thousands are already doing it and have done it, particularly from New York City, California, and Illinois. All three of those that I just listed will lose electoral votes and representation in Congress because of the flight that has already taken place. Now, the Democrats will bloviate about the meaning of this last election last week as if they are on a roll, but the registration numbers around the country say otherwise. Yes, it would have been nice to see the Republicans who have the solution to many of the problems in those states, but maybe this is what is needed to get people to move. Wednesday on the Alex Marlow show, host and Breitbart editor-in-chief Alex Marlow talked about Tuesday's elections. And Marlow said the great replacement is real. The left is trying to replace Americans with foreigners, partially because not only do they drive down wages, but they also are people who vote Democrat or their progeny vote Democrat. Well, given the results of the elections and the dirty little secrets that are now being spoken out loud, it turns out that the Democrat left devised that plan long ago. which I have written about, and some call it the Great Replacement, and it is actually coming into effect. Remember when all the Democrats tried to convince you that it was a conspiracy theory? Not so anymore, but you were told. Now, Mamdani in New York just said it and proved it. Large number of voters in New York were not born in this country. In fact, there are nearly 1 million Muslims in New York City. In Dearborn, Michigan, outside of Detroit, where I would visit an aunt there in the summers, you can't even go there anymore, as the mayor there says you're not welcome. Instead of hearing the sounds of church bells, you hear Islamic call to prayer. Remember, according to Barack Obama, the most beautiful sound in the world to him was the Muslim call to prayer. But you didn't listen to that, and you didn't listen to the fact that his grandparents and parents were communists. But you voted for him anyway because, what, was it white guilt? Shame on you, shame on us. He was another Marxist that many voted for. And I bet you don't know this. In the 1890s, there was a Supreme Court case that declared that the United States was a Christian nation. But the liberals have convinced you over the decades that that was wrong and that everyone is entitled to equal dignity, much like the communist mayor-elect in New York City said recently. You see how foolish we are to believe in things like this? Those toxic ideas need to be driven offshore of this country. There is no equivalency between Christianity and other religions, as it was Christianity that created the West, that has lifted mankind out of its barbarous past and has given us all the advances that we enjoy today. Now let's do some more vocabulary appropriation here. Discrimination is not a bad word, neither is prejudice. I discriminate daily, as do we all. It starts with, well, what am I going to wear in the morning for the day? We do it with who we choose to be friends with. We are called not to be unequally yoked with others. As I told my nephew years ago with regard to his selection of companions, are you averaging up or down? God tells us not to be unequally yoked, and that goes for marriage, business partners, and friendships. No, not everything is equal. And yes, to be prejudiced against what is bad and evil is a good thing. It's called exercising good discretion. Do not associate with those who have a blackened heart. For example, the people of Virginia, as I've already said, voted in a black racist Attorney General, Jay Jones, the Virginia Democrat candidate Attorney General, who just won election after it was revealed that he fantasized about murdering Republicans and their children. For those in Virginia who hear this message, you must be vigilant over the next 4 years and challenge everything this warped and wicked man does, as you will not get justice or fair and equal treatment under the law from him. But here's my question to you. Did you vote? Did your neighbors and family vote? And how did they vote? Yes, it's time to bring discipline to your own household, family, and friends. Hold those around you accountable. That's what's lacking in this country is accountability. Hold them accountable for their votes, particularly for a man like this, like Jay Jones. Eventually, people like Jones will justify all sorts of injustice because they are Machiavellian at heart. That is, the means they use, no matter how corrupt, is justified by the end. And they don't know what that end is, and you don't either. And it's never good. You have no idea as to how much your worldview has been warped. We are all called to make judgments every day, but you have been so conditioned that you no longer possess the tools with which to form good choices, as the wicked have taught you that good is bad and bad is good. You have been taught and conditioned that it is wrong to be discriminating and that the whole world is like us and equal to us and our standards. No, it's not. We are being diluted from what has made the West great, and we will end up a third world country, and many of you are voting it into office. You know, I have watched the deconstruction of America over the last few decades, and from purely objective, technical, and academic viewpoint, I couldn't have devised a better and more effective plan myself as what's being implemented by the Democrat left. The people were sucked in and the trap sprung. My solution would be to get yourselves back to church, but even that has been corrupted by weak men in the pulpit, and even worse, apostate women in the pulpit, which is scripturally forbidden. Now, I'm not saying don't go to church. In fact, that is exactly where you need to be. But the only way to deal with weak pastors is for you to know the book that he preaches from and hold him accountable. You just may make him better at what he's supposed to be doing, and it will give you the tools you need in life. In today's world, and with all the corruption in our education system, we all need to be autodidactic. And what that means is self-taught. So pick up the book and start reading it. Now, ultimately, you are responsible for yourself and how much you know. Just as you are responsible for your ultimate destiny of heaven or hell, remember, that is the free will that so many of you jealously cling to. Do you recall from my last podcast, I asked the question, do you have anything you believe in so strongly that you would die for it? Well, if you don't have much to live for. And with every day that passes, the life you are living for your own pleasure is quickly slipping away, and the next one to come will likely not be very pleasant. It's clear to me that in this country today, we are suffering from our success, born out of our past adversity. But remember this, victory in adversity does not guarantee victory in prosperity. And this is where we are failing. Given the cognitive dissonance that we see and how people cast their votes, their primary concern is with their own pleasure and an indifference to the consequences. We now vote in communist after millions around the world, including hundreds of thousands of our own servicemen, have died fighting it, and we vote in a black racist attorney general in Virginia who fantasizes about murdering his opposition. Now, over the last 20 years, the country has been increasingly run by executive order because Congress is impotent to do anything or get anything done. We saw that in just the recent government shutdown. Then, of course, from the Democrat left, we have seen unelected judges trying to run the country and usurp the powers of the presidency. Folks, I keep warning you that something has got to give, and we are looking at Civil War 2.0. The Democrat left want to bring you drag queen story hour, and the Republicans can't get anything done because there are not enough of them in office to get what needs to be done. So what's going on? Well, here I go again. The people are so stupid they simply cannot see their way past their cognitive dissonance to elect the right people. In the recent elections we had, and as Al Parada wrote and as published in the Daily Signal, New Yorkers handed Gotham to the Joker, the man with the smile painted on his face, married to ideologies of destruction and chaos. New Jersey and Virginia gave governorships to two Karens, two shrill liberals who dressed up as moderates, eager to force feed males into girls' locker rooms and playing fields. And finally, Californians voted in to strip Republican voters of nearly all congressional representation. Then the election of the despicable J. Jones in Virginia. The voters gave their full embrace of political violence. The biggest losers were those who hold the mistaken belief that a majority of Democrats don't wish them harm. You need to get back in touch with reality, folks. It's staring you in the face. How do you reach across the aisle with people who want to see you dead or your children dead in your spouse's arms? Folks, so many have been given over to a delusion. We deserve none of God's favor. As I have peeled back the layers of the onion, at its core is good, average, common sense Americans simply incapable of rousing themselves up to save their own hides. They perceive a Goliath that is one they helped create, and they fold their hands and simply wait for the end. It's amazing. As I said recently, over 500,000 who voted for Trump last year didn't vote. This was a capitulation, a surrender. I wish there was a place to run because I would go, but there isn't. You hear me rail against the demonic Democrat left all the time, but they only do what hell-bound people do. For all the Pollyannas out there, in this climate, And with all the empirical evidence swirling about us, if you don't think the left is heading for hell, I confidently say you don't know your scripture. And for those who say there is no hell, I say you can't wish it away. And in fact, your actions betray your denials. But hear me loud and clear on this. As much as the left will find the reward in hell, those who allowed them to ascend to the positions of power they have will reap the whirlwind of judgment as well. Many of them will likely be you or your family, friends, or neighbors who committed the sins of omission, failing to challenge evil if not promote it by your lifestyle. Now I want to talk to you about what's called the Universe 25, and this was an experiment that remains one of the most unsettling studies ever conducted in behavioral science. It was carried out by American ethologist John Calhoun between 1958 and 1962. And this is really interesting, folks. Calhoun built what he called the mouse paradise, an ideal environment with unlimited food, clean water, no predators, controlled temperature, and constant medical care. The mice had everything they needed. No hunger, no disease, no threats. At first, the population grew rapidly. The colony thrived. But around day 317, something changed. Once the population reached around 600 mice, the social structure began to break down. Dominant males became aggressive and territorial. They attacked others randomly. Some females responded by becoming violent toward their own youth. Others isolated themselves completely. Meanwhile, a group of males withdrew entirely from social life. They stopped fighting, stopped mating, stopped interacting. They spent their days grooming themselves, eating and sleeping. Calhoun called them the beautiful ones. They looked physically perfect, clean, well-groomed, but showed no interest in courtship, reproduction, or social roles. Kind of sounds like today, doesn't it? As these passive males increased in number, birth rates collapsed. Infant mortality rose to 100%. Sexual behavior broke down. Cannibalism and pathological violence appeared. Eventually, the colony stopped reproducing entirely. Even when conditions remained perfect, the population continued to decline until every mouse died. Calhoun repeated this process 25 times. Yes, it was reproducible. Each trial ended the same way. Collapse from within, not from starvation or disease or predators, but from a breakdown of social structure, purpose, and meaning. Since then, Universe 25 has been used as a model in urban sociology, population studies, psychology, and discussions on how abundance and disconnection can destroy societies. The conclusion was disturbing. When a population no longer needs to struggle for survival and no meaningful roles exist, social and behavioral collapse becomes inevitable. Universe 25 wasn't about mice. It was a warning, and it is happening in America and the West now. So why are we fighting communism inside this country? You allowed teachers' unions infiltrated with Marxist ideology, and you allowed tenured professors who were Marxist to indoctrinate your children. And you paid for it. The omissions are so great, we deserve to lose everything. Many of you didn't teach your children the horrors of communism. Here's what is happening in this country. In Seattle, the Seattle Times fired an editorial writer because he dared to say something negative against Vladimir Lenin, who was one of the greatest mass murderers of all time. This was raw communism that made fascism look like amateurs, and many of you haven't let your children know this. Let me put it into this perspective. Fascism killed 36 million people. Hitler was taking out people that he thought were dangerous to society. However, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao Zedong and their communist regimes murdered over 100 million people. And the big distinction between fascism and communism is that the communists knew that the people they were killing were innocent. This is no excuse for Hitler, but communism just by the numbers was 300 times worse than fascism. But getting back to my first example in Seattle, Seattle actually has a statue of Lenin. On the left, the problem is one of moral depravity and selective outrage. Many in Seattle excuse away and justify the Lenin statue as merely humorous, but the truth is others describe their undying respect for this man who murdered millions and also justify the need for violence. That is what is going to happen to millions of Americans because they can't conceive of the subhuman nature of the left. Lenin was a monster. He was privileged growing up, not an oppressed person. He grew up in comfort. He was an aristocrat. Lenin was malevolently intelligent and a calculating psychopath in the pure sense of the word, who has no use for the concepts of good. And this accounts for the irrelevance of body counts in assessing the psychological evil as well as the terrifying relevance of intellect. Lenin was an intellectual and what they call a primary psychopath, also known as the boring psychopath. As stated by David Velasco in his article on Lenin, it makes no sense to imagine a time in Lenin's youth where he might have been steered down a different path because his problem was biological, kind of like Hannibal Lecter, a type 1 psychopath who is not impulsive, but calculating and methodical, not dim-witted, but charming and manipulative. You can see how I'm tying this in to today. History does repeat itself, if not rhyme. We know that even in his early youth, Lenin was an immoral monster who tortured his siblings and displayed an inhuman lack of empathy. This is the mental mindset of the left today, folks. Don't miss that. Lenin was sadistic and displayed an inhuman lack of empathy. Renowned Irish psychiatrist Michael Fitzgerald wrote that Lenin showed a gross lack of empathy as a child, but at the same time could be charming. Fitzgerald adds that Lenin showed a rejection of concepts such as conscience, compassion, and charity, and only interested in using people for what he could get out of them. He was controlling, sadistic, and meticulous. Once Lenin came to power, Fitzgerald notes that Lenin loved having people killed and was clearly Machiavellian and a psychopath. Fitzgerald concludes by driving the point home, firmly home, by going line by line through the entry for antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, writing that Lenin was totally focused on himself and his desires and had empathy problems, intimacy problems, and was manipulative, deceitful, callous, irresponsible. He had a lust for violence, the kind of violence that we're seeing in the left today. Your children were deliberately kept from the knowledge of this history or they may very well die as a result of it. As I said in my book, America's Systemic Psychosis, I recounted the testimony of Yuri Bezmenov, a KGB defector, and he talked about the 4 stages of the communist plan to take over the United States, and we are now in the 4th stage. We misidentified communism, and we fall for the euphemistic terms democratic socialist, like Mamdani in New York is trying to label himself. He fooled the fools of New York. For him, it was like taking candy from a baby, from those God-hating hedonistic reprobates who voted for him. Communism morphed into a cultural virus instead of an economic one, and you swallowed it up in such things as DEI, wokeness, CRT, the stoking of racial division by accusing the innocent of racism, white privilege, feminism, phobias of every kind, and all for the purposes of destabilizing society, which was part of the Communist Manifesto and the Communist Agenda. But you didn't know that, and your kids weren't taught that. And that was by design. The bloom on this rot is seen in the campuses all around the country with protests and groups favoring the terrorist groups Hamas, and mixed in with it are the communist adjutants. These protests have intensified and are explicitly communist and racist and have garnered tremendous support. Approximately 200 progressive organizations, many backed by George Soros, who should have been jailed decades ago, have voiced solidarity with these protesters. Now, this should depress you, but hopefully it will drive home the point that I've been making about the Democrat left and an emerging civil war. Polling data shows only 28% of U.S. adults supporting protest. However, you have to look at the underlying numbers because that figure rises to 44% for people under 45 and 46% of Democrats. No surprise there. This coincides with the increase in communist and anti-American sentiment. You know, approximately 36% of Americans now view socialism positively. And remember, socialism is a euphemistic term for communism. 50% of the Democrats and 52% of Black Americans favor it, that is, socialism or communism, and they view it favorably. And 35% of millennials support elimination of capitalism and favor socialism, and 57% of Democrats now consider the Constitution as, you guessed it, racist. But this was all taught, and it was caught, and many of you caught it. One of communism's goals in the United States was to use race to divide the nation. And they accomplished that because so many in this country were willing to sacrifice anything to keep from being called a racist. Shame on us. We should have been in their faces and shoving that accusation down their throats. We were too concerned about appearing to be nice when you should have fired your PR department and acted like real and normal people as opposed to a made-up persona. As Velasco stated with regard to communism coming in through the culture, you no longer had to be versed in Marxist philosophy or know anything about economics. You just had to be non-white. In the end, racism was the cheat code to American exceptionalism. Sadly, we did this to ourselves. We have told our children for generations that America is a racist, sexist, colonial, and genocidal empire. We have used Marxist critical theory to deconstruct everything from the Revolutionary War to Mickey Mouse. We've been told our national anthem is racist. Our national flag is racist. The bald eagle is racist. Even the term American is racist. The social activist Raj Patel argued that apple pie is racist. We have been teaching our children to hate their own country for decades, and they have finally gotten the message. And I bet you didn't challenge it at all, or try to teach them, or try to fire their teachers or the Marxist professors. I've been fighting this from the age of 16. I saw it. The writing was clear on the wall for me. And my disgust for America's cognitive dissonance, it knows no bounds. We don't deserve what we have, and God is about to take it away from us. I don't want the suffering and the death that comes with this, but sometimes this is the only way to purge the mind and bring clarity of thought. There are communist parades in Seattle, and people just wave as they sip their lattes, and they just wave, and nothing's wrong. Everything's just fine. As the communist parades march past Lenin. Can you imagine that happening in this country? But it happened because we did nothing about it. As Bezvanov warned us about the mental illness of the left and of communists, there's no getting rid of these people as you can't reason with them. I've been screaming that to people for ages. You can't inundate them with information and with authentic proof, with documentation and pictures, and you could even take them by force to the Soviet Union and show them the concentration camps, and they will still refuse to believe it. As they say, you can't reason some people out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. And the new left is not only emotional, but hysterical. This is why Bezvanov said the first stage takes a generation because the communists had to build an entire cultural ecosystem, and they did it using your schools, your media, and the film studios. The kids today are now so thoroughly demoralized from American culture, they become nihilistic. Velasco said, we may very well need another 40 years to take this all apart, and that assumes we start now. But I don't think that is possible given the ineptness and indolence of those who would or should naturally be on my side. The only way out, if it's not too late, is to educate yourselves, which is why I go to the extent that I do in my books, published articles, and podcasts. As I stated in a recent podcast regarding Communist Mamdani's, that is New York City's new communist mayor, he comes in with a smile, but he'll leave with executions. This is going to start happening more and more in our citadels of atheism, that is, our cities. We need laws and prosecutions for those who ignore federalism. We must put a noose around the necks of our cities and rein them in. They are out of control. It is time for intolerance. And yes, you heard me correctly. It's time to stop tolerating the mentally ill who you have been sending to Washington, D.C. and to your state governments. As you have just learned from the discussion about dictator Lenin, and the same with Hitler and Mao Zedong, the undisputable mass murderers of all time, the psychological analysis of these people found them all to be type 1 psychopaths with personality disorders, devoid of empathy, but manipulative of those around them with a fake charm as well as fake compassion. That's a big thing that the Democrat left always push on you, is their fake compassion. This has been made up by the Democrat left, and we see it every day. You no longer analyze the person anymore. Too many today base their votes upon star quality or celebrity. Dismissed all too often are the screaming signs that something is dreadfully wrong with this person, such as with Jay Jones of Virginia, who wanted to murder his opponents and his children's, and with nothing more than an "I'm sorry." And Virginians elected him. This sickness in Virginia comes from Northern Virginia, where there is a concentration of all the government workers from D.C., largely picked by the mentally ill Democrat left. Now, here's another example of how we as voters have lost our minds. And this is amazing. This last week, Daniel Carson, a leader in the Communist Party of Maine, and a convicted felon and murderer, Angela Walker, you need to be sitting down for this, were elected to the Bangor City Council. Yep, deep, dark, atheist Maine. The people have lost their way, and they elected these type of people to their council. Then you have AOC and Schumer and Cohen and Murphy and Pelosi and the rest of the motley crew who yell out things like Trump wants to kill your children, or ICE agents are Gestapos, and they are deporting innocent Americans, and that Trump is going to take your medical care from you. You know these claims to be patently wrong and a lie. So why would anyone trust such liars to run the country? Why would you ever even vote for them? But I don't want you to miss this. 40% of New York City is made up of people who have only lived there 5 years or less and are foreign-born. 85% of them voted for Communist Mamdani. Now let's rewind the tape of 4 years of Biden, when he opened up the borders and millions flooded into the country. You see, the foreign-born will make this country third world, and they always default to the same thinking and actions that destroyed their countries of origin. This is what the Democrat left wanted. I would put every one of them on trial for treason tomorrow if I could, and would ask for the maximum penalty. They may have destroyed the world's greatest hope for peace and civilized society. It was a selfish and corrupt lust for power at any cost. It was suicidal, and we all know this is mental illness. And if you don't recognize this, given all the evidence, then you might be mentally ill as well. Now let's talk about immigration for a minute. But for pure economic reasons, there is no particular fear with regard to those fleeing Ukraine or from Hong Kong, or those who were fleeing communism from China, or even people coming in from South America. And for the most part, that is because there is assimilation. These people assimilate. But now, not all immigrants are the same. And we can see that within our own history from immigrants that came from Ireland and Poland, Italy, and on. They all assimilated. Their cultures do not threaten the American culture or the American dream. What is really at the core of the immigration issue today is the concern and fear, which few will say as clearly as I am, it's Islam. As Konstantin Christen said, it's not a fear of what could happen in the future, but rather a fear of what has happened in the past. And it's not just the distant past. What is so important to understand is that so much of the anti-immigration concern comes from what is called incompatible cultures. I want you to put that in your vocabulary, and let me repeat it again. There are incompatible cultures, and not just incompatible, but destructive to ours and any Western nation. The problem is Islam, and we all know it. 75% of England's MI5 caseload, MI5 is our FBI, the equivalent of our FBI. 75% of their caseload deals with Islamic terrorism. Only 6% of England is Islamist, but they have an inordinate degree of control through intimidation and their use of what I call useful idiots in the country and in the West. That is the white liberal and leftist. They excuse away everything because they are cowards to deal with the problem. But maybe it's not so much that as much as it is that Islam is more comfortable from an authoritarian standpoint to the Democrat left and liberals, so they turn a blind eye to the problem with Islam. When some protest students on campuses around the country were confronted with the inconvenience fact that with Islam, if it took over, they would have to either convert or be beheaded, they immediately responded that, well, we'll convert. Another way the Democrat left deals with the problem with Islam is that if you bring up the issue, they will either call you Islamophobic or racist or a slew of other pejorative terms. Let me digress for a moment. You see, there's nothing wrong with a phobia, but you have been conditioned by the left to think that there is. I have a phobia of snakes and spiders, and what that does for me is it keeps me from being bitten and possibly killed by toxins. If you don't know how to swim, it is to your benefit to have a phobia toward water. However, as all liberals and leftists do, they take what is good and turn it on its head, and they find it so easy to do because the rest of us simply don't want to confront the lie. As Gad Saad, a Lebanese-Canadian evolutionary psychologist and professor of marketing at Concordia University in Montreal, known for applying evolutionary psychology to consumer behavior, and who is also known for his public commentary on topics like postmodernism, political correctness, and cultural issues, and particularly the problem of Islam, he said there is no such thing as radical Islam. There is simply Islam. Let me repeat that. He said there is no radical Islam, there is simply Islam. The liberal leftist whites have been gaslighting you that there is no problem with Islamic immigrants. Oh, yes, there is. And it is the singular biggest problem with our immigration. They don't want to be part of us. They want you to become them. Yes, there are peaceful Muslims, but most of them simply do not follow the dictates or even know the Quran. But when you dig a little deeper, you will find that when polled, they will agree with the violence of the terrorists. We see that in Michigan. And when they were asked about, when the Muslim community in Michigan, which is huge, when they were asked about the slaughter of Israeli children and women on October 7th, a majority of the Muslims in Michigan agreed with it. In fact, they do agree with violence in the name of Islam. To make things worse, try to go to Dearborn, Michigan, and you will quickly see that you are not welcome in your own country. And the mayor there is most likely to tell you that you're not. It is in these instances that I say that denaturalization is essential, followed by deportation. This is an incompatible culture. They will not assimilate. They want to create a new country within our country, and that cannot stand. As I have said at the outset of this podcast, I have one of the most diverse friendships of anyone that I know, which even includes people from Iran, Lebanon, and Syria. They are peaceful, but they are the rare ones, and they have assimilated, and that's probably why I'm able to have any kind of relationship with them. Americans have a right to their own culture. If you move here, then enculturate and assimilate. If you don't, leave and go back to the culture you came from. It is not incumbent upon us to change. It is them that must change or leave. Okay, folks, I know I went long, but the information is timely and necessary for you to know and to spread. So with that, thank you for joining me. And until next week, I'm Jack Richardson for Jack's Corner.